No, that's okay.
Okay, so this is another card question for Dr. Williamson. It says that you've never addressed the issue of how one can explain a personal experience with God. How would you explain miracles and when God speaks with people and other things like that?
What personal experience of God? I mean, do I have to believe in that? See, I'm not convinced that somebody saying, but Jesus talked to me this morning, is much more than a saying it. I mean, unless saying it actually does make it so, I think I'm within my rights to be skeptical of this experience, particularly since it seems to be something that either you get third-party reports or it happens to you directly. I guess I'm waiting for it to happen to me. Though the lightning bolt is much more likely.
As I said when I presented this, it's not an argument for God's existence. And in that sense, I think Dr. Williams' response is quite right. Rather, I'm claiming for the person who has the immediate experience of God, it is rational for him to believe in God on the basis of that experience, unless he's got some other overriding reason to think that he's deluded. And so what I would encourage you to do, and Dr. Williamson to do, is to engage in a spiritual experiment. Begin to read the Bible and to pray and ask God to make himself real to you. Begin to go to worship or something of that sort. Begin a spiritual quest or journey and ask God to make himself real to you and see what happens.
All right, so we'll go back to questions from the floor. So question for Dr. Craig.
Hello, my question is that none of the physical Big Bang theories out there, none of them have the physicists start by saying, God did it, then the Big Bang. That's why they're investigating it. And it cannot be scientific to include God did this or God before that, because it defies the principle of falsifiability, which is the cornerstone of our science. We cannot fill the gaps. Yep, there is a question. So how do you explain basically the technique of filling the gaps of what we know right now with simply God did it when there is no way of testing it?
Yeah. This is a wonderful question. Could we have the slide on the cosmological argument up again? Notice that I am not proposing God as a sort of theoretical entity in a scientific theory. So you are quite right in saying that scientists don't include God as part of their cosmology, but neither am I. All I'm using the scientific evidence for is empirical support for that second premise, the universe began to exist, which is a religiously neutral statement that can be found in any textbook on astronomy and astrophysics. The theological implications only emerge in the context of a philosophical argument that isn't a scientific argument. This isn't an exercise in metaphysics, literally beyond physics. So I'm not using God of the gaps reasoning. I'm not using God as a scientific entity. I'm not doing theistic science. I'm simply saying that the best current science we have makes premise 2 more plausible than not. And the religious significance of this only emerges in the context of this broader philosophical argument.
You know, honestly, I'm not convinced by your response, Dr. Craig. It seems to me that we are talking about a competition between some possible scientific theory that it will tell us something about how the Big Bang came to be, and God is doing the explaining there. I mean, in short, the question is, do we have a scientific theory for the origin of the universe, or do we necessarily have to fall back on God? And I guess I'd like to point out some things that would be missing from God doing the explaining. I think, like our questioner was alluding to. For example, what would thinking God started the Big Bang give us in the way of predictions? Could we predict the eventual shape of the universe? Could we predict whether or not we're expanding to nothing or coming back to a big crunch? Doesn't seem like God would allow us to predict that. Once you get to God doing it, then it seems like all you get is God doing it. Are you pointing that at me? Oh, sorry. He's telling me to stop. Scientific theories typically also allow us an integration of other theories. Like think about static electricity and magnetism. We get a more powerful theory, and it brings two unrelated or previously unrelated phenomena together. I'm not convinced that God would do that for the physical universe in any way. I mean, I'd agree with the questioner that God can't function as a scientific theory, and I appreciate your response, but I'm worried that there is still room for a competition between God and a scientific theory there.
Okay, question for Dr. Williamson.
Hi,
Sorry
Dr.
about
Williamson. You spoke at the beginning of your argument, you talked about proof and the burden thereof.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering how you sort of reach a definition in your argument. Do you see that it just continuing on infinitely involving little more than just finding inconsistencies in the opposing side? Or can you imagine some situation where there would be a definitive proof for either God's existence or conversely his non-existence? Like, is there anything like absolute that you can conceive of that you would accept for those conditions?
Oh, to prove God to me,
Well,
or
either one. Is there any situation where you conceive of anyone saying definitively God exists or God does not exist?
Well, I guess it seems to me the question's tied up with more than reason, since obviously the question of religion isn't a completely rational topic. I know we've both tried to press the issue of reason, but then there's that issue of direct experience of God, and I think you'd be suggesting that that's not something that's immediately rational in itself. Mm-hmm. And I guess there's also the question of what God's plan is, and I'm not sure how one would come up with that apart from revelation. I'm not sure I haven't heard you give anything that would lead us to think that there's a detailed plan back there that can be worked out by principles of reason. Perhaps that simply has to be revealed. I mean, honestly, I think I'm convinced by things like the problem of evil, and we only saw a tiny bit of that problem tonight. The problem of the incoherence of the concept of God, we saw only a small amount of that tonight as well. I'm convinced by these things. But once again, I think the problem involves more than reason, and I kind of doubt that we're ever going to come to an end of it.
It's funny, I don't know where Dr. Williamson is, but I have met many atheists for whom nothing would convince them that God exists. And therefore, the fact that they don't find the evidence compelling, in a sense, becomes trivial because no amount of evidence would convince them that God exists. I do think that Dr. Williamson is correct also in saying that this does involve irrational matters as well. It involves a certain openness to God. I think it was Thomas Huxley who said, I don't want God to exist. I don't want to live in a universe like that. I want my human autonomy. And for a person like that, they can simply refuse to be convinced. So there are volitional factors that enter into the picture here as well as rational ones.
Thank you.